So I'm not going to actually go from books like I have. I'm really going to go from my heart for this hour. And, the Catechism says that the Eucharist is the source and the summit of our faith, which means everything comes from it. And it's the apex, it's the top. It's the most important crowning point. And everything comes from it and points to it. So it's really important that we understand this. And I want to begin with a story, and I printed it because when I start thinking about it or trying to tell it, I often cry, and I hope I don't cry on this video. This morning when I read it again, I started weeping. It is the most beautiful story of a little Chinese martyr, and many of you may have heard it before, but if not, it's worth listening to. And Archbishop Fulton Sheen heard this story, and it led him to make a vow to do a holy hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament every day. Even when he was really busy as an archbishop and he was on TV and all of this, he would make a holy hour every day because of the example of this little Chinese girl. And so the Chinese came and invaded. This was presumably around 1949 when the communists came into China. And when they came to this parish, the priest was very nervous, but they didn't really bother him. And he kind of watched out to see what was going to happen. And one day someone came to the door and, asked him some questions, but then left, and he thought that it would be fine. Well, finally the day came where 4 soldiers showed up, and they came to the school. And they started screaming at the school children. They took all the crucifixes and the statues and everything. And they scream at them to go and to put them down the toilet. And the children refused at first. And eventually, they did it because they were afraid. But in the back of the room was one little girl who didn't move. And she had her hands folded and her head bowed, and she was weeping. And the soldier came up to her. And he shot a gun. And he kept saying, "Take this, take this." And they would cause this big ruckus to try to hurt her. So eventually she refused to be part of the desecration, and they said, "Go get her father." And they brought her father in. As a church filled with people, the little girl's father was ushered in with hands bound behind his back, placed to the right of the communion rail in the church. Immediately, the girl was forcefully shoved to the communion rail. The inspector spoke to the crowd and mocked the people's belief in the real presence. And in a malicious and sarcastic tone, he announced that they were tricked into believing that God was present in the tabernacle. In fact, he told them that his gang of soldiers would stomp on the hosts with their boots to show that nothing would happen. Then the soldiers rushed on to the tabernacle, forcing it open with their revolvers. The tense crowd watched in silent disbelief. The inspector seized the ciborium, took off the lid, and scattered the hosts all over the sanctuary floor. Egging on his soldiers, he ordered them to go and step on the hosts. And without hesitation, they carried out the dastardly act. Not content with that, he taunted the crowd. "Do you still believe in the fairy tales that priest told you?" Turning to the child's father, he asked him if he still believed. No sooner did the father say yes than they ordered that the father be arrested and hauled away. A non-commissioned officer then entered the scene who spoke with the inspector. They reached an agreement, and the inspector submitted to higher authority. The crowd was told to disperse, leaving the little girl alone at the communion rail. The soldiers incarcerated the priest in the church's coal bin, where a small opening allowed him to see the area of the sanctuary where the holy blessed hosts lay strewn on the floor, as well as the little girl who was leaning on the wall. I'm going to cry. While peering through the opening, the priest saw a lovely young woman clad in beautiful garments enter and smile. As she hugged her, she said, "Poor child, my poor little one, what have these men done to you? Come with me, will you?" The child broke into sobs and sought the comfort of the woman's arm, and they left. As time went by, the priest lost track of hours and days while imprisoned in the coal bin. He endured the stillness of the surroundings, and at times he heard sounds that he wasn't used to. One morning, he heard that door open quietly. I'm sorry, she's gonna die. It's so beautiful. Through the little opening, the priest saw the little Chinese girl sneaking ever so carefully into the sanctuary, kneeling and bowing in homage. As she lowered her head, she took the desecrated host with her tongue. She wouldn't even touch it. She raised her head, folded her hands, closed her eyes, and prayed in silence. Several moments later, she arose and she departed. Every morning, that priest witnessed the uplifting scene that became a source of comfort inside the dark and somber environment of his makeshift prison cell. There he eagerly waited the break of dawn, expecting to see the sweet, enchanting little girl receive and adore the host. Though it occurred many times, he couldn't recall how often she came to practice the soul-stirring daily ritual. But alas, the final day of reckoning came. As the little heroine went through her daily pious exercise one morning, knees bent, hands folded, absorbed in deep prayer, the church door behind her burst open. Tumultuous screams stirred the air, and a shot rang out. As the priest hurriedly looked through his peephole, he saw the pallid little girl crawl agonizingly along the floor as she quickly reached a host after she had been shot to receive her last Holy Communion. When the soldier drew near to check on her, she tried in vain to pull herself up and fold her hands. Instead, she fell back on her head and hit the floor with a thud. The little Chinese girl martyr lay dead, motionless on the floor. For a moment, the soldier stood hesitant, not knowing what to make of his deed and its fatal outcome. Finally, he turned around and stormed out of the church. The priest was in a state of shock. While he pondered on what he had seen, the prison door opened and the same soldier went in and announced that the priest was to go free. Without any hesitation, he scampered towards the sanctuary to find the lifeless little girl. He knelt beside her, and the soldier approached him and said, "Sir, if in every town there was one such little girl, no soldier would ever fight for the communists." Fortunately, the priest had time to give the little martyr a decent burial. As he left the cemetery and walked along the road, a man approached him, invited him to his car, and dropped him at the border and got him out of the country. I didn't think I was going to cry. That's love for Jesus and the Eucharist. That's love for Jesus and the Eucharist. Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. It is his body, his blood, his soul, and his divinity that we receive at Mass every day, every Sunday. There's another story I want to share from 1996 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. There was a Eucharistic minister that when somebody approached and came to him, dropped the host. And it was very dirty on the floor, and so he didn't want to consume the host. So the priest came and took and put the host in some water in the tabernacle, and usually that's what they do, and then the water will disintegrate the host, and then they dispose of that properly. Well, after 6 days, the priest came, and he was baffled because the host had grown in size and looked like pieces of flesh, and there were little pieces of blood interspersed, and he thought, oh, this is crazy. And so he left it for a few more days, and when he came back, it was a living piece of bloody flesh. So he called a scientist in there from Argentina, and they did tests on it and found red blood cells, white blood cells, hemoglobin, and that they found by studying this that it was a living, beating cells. They weren't dead cells. And they didn't know what to make of it. So in 2004, almost 8 years later, they contacted a specialist doctor in New York that specialized in studying the hearts of people who had died. And they sent him a sample. And the doctor came back and he was blown away because he said, it is, from a heart muscle of a man who had been tortured. Well, Jesus had been tortured on the cross. And he said, there's one thing that I don't understand. He said, if this is from a man who died in 1996, why were the cells I was studying living and beating? They weren't from a dead person, they're from a living person. So then they told the doctor what it was from, and he almost pulled his hair out, it says, because he didn't know what to make of it. So then it went a little further. Because in the 8th century in Lanciano, Italy, there was a priest that at the moment of consecration at Mass had doubted that that was really Jesus. And that host turned into flesh, and we still have it today. Well, in the 70s, scientists studied it and said that it also came from a man who had been tortured and all of that, from a living person. And so they cross-examined the samples from Argentina and Lanciano, Italy. And what they discovered were they came from the same man who had been tortured. The Eucharistic miracle in Argentina and the Eucharistic miracle from the 8th century in Lanciano came from the same person. If you ever doubted that what you receive in the Eucharist, hidden under the appearance of bread, was truly Jesus, these stories should prove it to you. Jesus is very good. He knows that humans would be disgusted and trying to eat flesh that was bloody and pulsating, right? So he hides his presence under the accidents of bread and wine. But it's truly him veiled in that mystery.